about Frey, and also introduce our two graduate student speakers who will be responding to Frey following this discussion. We have purposefully chosen this room, which is quite intimate now with all of you here. It's so nice to have so many. Frey is also unique in his efforts to bridge art, science, and philosophy, with a particular interest and focus in neuroscience and concrete ongoing collaborations with scientists, particularly with scientists currently working at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. He also has conducted extensive theoretical research on issues having to do with vision, embodiment, perception, as well as writing articles and giving talks related to globalization and the commodification of art.
Dear friends, let me first express my gratitude to Professor Dr. Megan Drake for her invitation and very kind introduction. It's good she didn't kill the lights immediately after she was finished. I would glow in the dark. Megan belongs to the small category of artists and thinkers who are not only concerned about their own art. I always have admired her for her own bright ideas and her own passion. I would very briefly like to welcome some special people who are here. That's the artist Natvar Babsa, the artist Lynn Stern, the artist James Justic, and Irvin Sandler, who you already saw briefly on the video. Irv is the leading art critic who started out being a critic in the late 50s here in New York. So I'm very honored that he's here. Though this talk is only a short introduction to my new book, I still hope to make clear we are on the verge of an entire different approach for understanding art, focusing on the in fact summarize the biology of our organism, mind, body as unity, contradicts our desire for harmony and a durable equilibrium. Not the accomplishment of lasting harmony or equilibrium is the objective, but the process of searching or longing for equilibrium. Because works of art are human-made translations of exactly such experiences, and therefore as accessible to other humans. Artworks that successfully combine features of happiness with features of unhappiness, of life and death, in an aesthetics that synthesizes the perfect with the imperfect, move us and stay in our consciousness.
To understand bodiness, we must make a distinction between bodiness and embodiment, a close neighbor. In Merleau-Ponty's definition, embodiment is the state in which the lived body becomes an intermediary between the self and the world. As I understand it, the term bodiness, while similarly grounded in phenomenology, differs in that it is not predicated on the acknowledgement of the separation of the body, the physical self, with the perceived phenomenal world. Whereas embodiment describes the recognition of the mutual relation of body, perceived as self, and world, an interactivity that incites an essential awareness in the self of its very material being and its capacities. Bodiness is perception as whole body experience, a physical interaction of the viewer with the viewed object, involving an implied unity of body and mind.
Over the body. In contrast to this widespread intellectualization of art, you argue persuasively that we must understand our experience of art in broader terms, not just as a mental encounter, but as the experience of a unity of both mind and body. In Chapter 6 of the Hypothesis of Bodiness, you offer an incredibly helpful analogy, which I think illuminates very nicely your conception of bodiness. This analogy hinges on a parallelism between the way that we understand speech and the way that we experience works of art. Let us first look at the example of speech. When we understand what someone is saying to us, we do not merely perceive and identify a series of auditory sound patterns or phonemes. We also attend to the mobile body of our interlocutor, to the gestures and movements of her face, eyes, and mouth, to her body as a whole. It is our ability to do the latter which makes the former possible.
It's really, when you write a book or publish a book, you throw it into the world, the best thing you can expect is that two brilliant brains take time to think about it and come with their own thoughts. That's the main thing First, in the second, I would like to add also that the core of my book is to emphasize that there are aspects in creating art and in experiencing art which everybody in principle knows, but nobody is touching.
So there's a great deal of talk in the art world, and at our schools there's a great deal of teaching of theory courses, I do theory, this sort of thing.
Yeah.
For me, theory is fine as long as it illuminates,
Yeah.
but the artwork comes first, and it's that experience that you're describing that makes me think that this is, well, it may not be new. There may have been previous generations that urged this kind of approach to the artwork, but right now, in its contemporary context, it seems quite refreshing. I notice just a little footnote to that the works that you chose to show, I haven't seen everything in your book, but the works that you chose to show seemed very labor intensive, which would certainly support Emily's emphasis on the hand and the work of art as a traces of the body in its engagement with the material, with the real. I'm not sure that there's a question there, except would you accept the idea that you're an anti-theory theorist?
It sounds like a brilliant compliment. But in principle, it should.
Of bodiness, the whole would be where what we call the subject, the human subject, used to be. Is this an empty body, so to speak, an impersonal or pre-personal body, or is it also a subject in a sense that we haven't yet, at least I couldn't hear you discuss?
In principle, the subject of everything is the self in the world. And in that sense, of course, the body plays a role, but it's not isolated inside the body. It's continuously in interaction with everything around us. And that makes also that in perception, of course, the whole mind-body plays a role. And I think there's a difference with Merleau-Ponty and some other thinkers. And that's a given, like I said, from science. It's not to lean continuously on science, but it's not just another theory. It's just bringing in facts we know in the meantime are facts.
Another way to put it, is there an individuated subject?
In the end, we have a lot in common, but we do not only have things in common.
Okay.
And that's also why, for instance, every artist knows this. When you go to, you have an exhibition, you hear the responses on an artwork, you're most of the times shocked or surprised what other people see in your work or don't see. Because for yourself it's very obvious, but for every other person it's obvious to them that it's exactly something else.
Yuri?
Yeah.
It was interesting, I thought, that you started off with a quote by William James, who very often referred to himself as an anti-intellectual, and of course, privileged experience in his own work. I was wondering if maybe you could speak a little bit about the intersection of William James and experience in his work with your project.
Well, I read William James, but I'm not William James specialist, so that's a little difficult for me to get into. I knew coming to a class of philosophy, people would come up with questions like that, and I can only be honest about it. But
I spent 50 years painting in New York. I have known Andy Warhol and all that.
yeah.
Culturally, he's a big hero here.
Yeah.
And I see his work, because I give you example of ordinary thing. In Guggenheim, he had a painting which was Last Supper. And I asked the guard, how many minutes everybody stands in the front of? He said 1 second.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that all throughout my life, because his first show happened when I was a student at University of Pennsylvania.
Complexity, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think you said one way to think about that is in terms of difficulty. And I wondered how you thought about that, equating in some way complexity and difficulty.
Also point of view. From a perceptual point of view, how, like we have discussed, like also brought up, your eyes have to look at something which keeps attracting your eyes, like I explained. so your eyes and your brain need a certain level of complexity.
Would you say that what you are talking about is actually achieving happiness through the experience of art?
You understand, in music it has been proven before that it diverts focus of your brain, and the diversion of your brain, you interpret yourself as a moment of tranquility or of happiness. So, but also in music, the music itself does not have to be happiness per se. So the artwork itself, also in fine art, should not necessarily express happiness or sadness or whatever. It can be anything, as long as it evokes in you a diversion of attention of your brain.
I think we do need a term that talks about enduring well-being
Yes.
in the world, and maybe art isn't designed for that. Maybe that's you get from I don't know what, religion or maybe philosophy. I'm not sure, but
At that point, the brain cannot stand an equilibrium, because then you cannot focus on anything. You need almost like Cézanne already said, like we all know, it's all about contrast. He of course did not know anything about neuroscience, but it's very much to the point.
I was curious about your thinking about that. I was thinking also about Derrida's text on Memoirs of the Blind and other accounts of blindness. But then you are so engaged in all of this multi-sensory activity. So it's there's music, but the kind of touch that you're involved in between painting and sculpture, the different mediums you use. So anyway, if you might say something else about that.
Yes, I focus on visual perception because that's our first way of perceiving.
And differentiate between artistic diversion and entertainment.
There's of course not like a clear definition again, but entertainment will not stay in your memory very long and in your experiencing of the entertainment, and a profound experience will last longer. I can't be more specific because that's per individual person clearly also different. Tell me in 3 lines what your work is about. And that's of course that's the level of entertainment.
Sometimes you do things you will something, but the neurons you say I'm going to get up in the morning and do this, and later on you don't do it. Somebody makes the decision.
I read a New York Times article by some neuroscientist who is a Harvard professor who taught at the law school here, and he's saying that, well, there'll be questions raised about whether you killed that person or the neuron in your brain did it.
I wanted you to go back and talk some more about obsession. I wanted to put in a word in favor of obsession, in the sense that you wanted to identify sort of pathological obsession, which would stop us doing any work at all. And a lot of what you said about insecurity and making art sounded familiar to me about writing. It's a question of you have to be anxious enough to want to write, but then not so anxious that you can't write anything. But
everyone's nodding.
Yes, I frequently encountered artists who, without thinking like a marketing slogan, said, "I'm obsessive," and so I'm opposing to that. Okay. What I tell now is, you understand neuronal growth, like I mentioned. That when you focus repeatedly on something, it is known that tiny, but there's some neuronal growth, and that helps you in your specialization to more quickly access your specialization. And that's a very interesting thing. And then comes a hypothesis, which I think I mentioned somewhere in my book, which is it's not a fact, I'm honest about that, is that if an artist, say, paints squares, and has painted repeatedly squares, then he will probably have a neuronal growth specializing in painting squares. Then it will become like almost impossible to get out of the square. So if you want to develop as an artist, like the same with writing, when you occasionally then you have to step back and you think, hey, I'm still doing the same. And then you have to kind of develop a new neuronal growth specialized on breaking out of this routine. And that's hypothetical. But with the motor reflex thing, and that I intended not in a mechanical way, you can can see it in many artists. Like a good example just came to mind is Bjorn de Koning. But since he did all his things he did, and when looking back, you can retrace certain forms and ways of working to his early work. It's always through all his development, but from the late 60s on, his work doesn't change that much, and they can become maybe reduced in colors and many forms, but it's in his body. He doesn't have to think. The forms come out, and obviously every single painting is still entirely different.
This color against this color, or in this process, in this order, in this way. So that choosing of materials, I was just thinking about how that relates to some sort of unclear impetus of the artist.
In my own experience, and I think that's for most creative people, is that creativity is most inspired when perimeters are set. That's, for instance, I was fortunate to do quite a few commissions for corporations and private places, and it's always you have first to discuss what's possible and where, and the space itself, etc. And somehow, because of these set perimeters, you come to entirely new steps, also in your own work. I don't know if that answers completely. And in the studio, of course, through the years, you set your own perimeters without being aware of it. You prefer certain sizes of canvas, say, or of sculpture. You have the size of the given size of your studio, which sets perimeters, and you have some preference for certain materials, indeed. And then, indeed, nobody in his studio has like 500 possible colors lying around. So you set somehow your own parameters through the years.
To develop a new approach to how we think of the artist and art, and how your work is trying to embody that new approach. But I'm wondering, is there a chance that this might fall in line with maybe a more ancient understanding of these phenomenon, say that you find in ancient Greece in Doric art with the Parthenon, for example, where you have a building that is built in precise proportion to the body, not out of any sort of symbolic representation, but in an effort to, or with the purpose of enhancing the experience that one has dwelling in it and looking out through it. So my question is just, is this really as new as we want to think it is?
I think it's not necessarily new. It's a revalidation of bits and pieces of knowledge through human history. But it differs from the example from the Greek, because they were thinking about certain rules for aesthetics, and I think that's and they changed their art accordingly. My approach is there are enough facts from neuroscience to look again on the art we have around us already for centuries, and better understand by on all this diversity of art we respond in a certain way. So it's not going, it will never lead to the 10 golden rules of making a great work of art. Unfortunately, but fortunately.
I think we have time probably for one more question if there is one, but otherwise I think it would be appropriate to thank Frey.
So one last thing I try and homework for everybody is, if you keep thinking about this art being closer to your biology than so far has been noticed, the notion of that the experience of works of art being an individual experience is necessary for what I call this health issue. Again, not to cure diseases, but for what normally should happen every day in your brain, this diversion of attention. Then you have to, as a conclusion, to open up also the discussion what's wrong with our museums, because they have become money machines. The board wants them to have much more attendance, and everybody who likes the art doesn't want to have more attendance, because then you can't have this experience of looking at the works of art. So that's one of the things to think about, and I hope quite a few of you will come up with your own approach to this. There's a lot to tackle in the art world which is not being considered. It's all about marketing, and it might be that quite a few rules for marketing should not apply to art, especially because it's closer to our humanity.